Bring forth the ring.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son.
And in the comments, I saw several people point out that these movies made the prequels look better by comparison. Now, this isn't a news statement or point of discussion.
These films proved that even something as great as Star Wars can turn to the dark side.
Man, it is a gift.
It's hard to believe that it's been 25 years since Star Wars The Phantom Menace first released in theaters. 25 years. A quarter of a century since 1999. Wow. Anyone born in that year must sure be old by now. The prequels received a ridiculous amount of hype when they were first released, and the amount of merchandise put out for The Phantom Menace is unrivaled for any other Star Wars film. There were Star Wars cookbooks made for this movie. Yet the general consensus for the film from critics was less than stellar. Phantom was criticized for stiff acting, bad dialogue, and nonsensical plot, boring debate scenes, and especially Jar Jar Binks. These kinds of criticisms would carry over to the subsequent films as well. Yet most of the criticisms against these films, at least at first, seem to come from the media more than fans. I mean, I think that's true. This was before the time when a whole lot of people were on the internet. That era was just barely getting started. Growing up, I was completely oblivious to the fact that the prequels were hated at all. I thought everyone loved them and that the Attack of the Clones was cinematic excellence. Okay, I was like 4 when I thought that, and it was mainly because I loved the arena scene at the end. It was only as I got older and started to spend more time on the internet, I realized, wow, these films are a lot more hated than I thought. Reading reviews as, I don't know, a 9 or 11-year-old made me see the criticisms of the films and start to rethink on exactly what pedestal I had them on. But while the mainstream media have always hated these films, I don't think the widespread negative conversation on them started within the mainstream fans until Red Letter Media's infamous Mr. Plinklet review for the prequels went viral, voicing many of the problems with the film publicly in a very entertaining fashion.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son.
The reviews brought down the complexity of the flaws of the films, and for many seemed to finally articulate their negative feelings towards them. But the Plinklet reviews did not put a stake in the prequels for good. Rather, they contributed to the heated Star Wars prequels debate that continues to this very day. People either jumping aboard to hate the prequels or defend them. It seems to be a topic that still means a lot to people. I knew a group of friends in high school who got into a massively heated debate on whether or not these films are good. And as time passed and these feelings towards Star Wars in general changed thanks to what happened with the sequels, I still see people return to these films, even taking the Mr. Plinklet review into question on its points against the film. And so, the discussion goes on. But even with the new undeniable division caused by the Star Wars sequels, the Star Wars prequels remain talked about. They got a massive spread for their anniversary in Empire magazine. Actor Ian McGregor has noted that the attitude for the films has massively changed since when they first came out, and that when he was once broken by the negativity towards the films, he now welcomes the new wave of love for the series. You still see love for the prequels everywhere. Someone made a 12-hour video dedicated to The Phantom Menace. A 12-hour video. What is it about these very flawed, messed up films that remain so talked about today? The ongoing analysis of what worked and what didn't work, the memes, all of it. Is it because of nostalgia? That's the prevailing thought among most, that the reason why most of us still have a soft spot for the prequels is that we grew up with them as kids with no taste, and that to this day, nostalgia blinds all. That theory may hold weight considering the current overall positivity towards the films. The generation that grew up with them has finally matured, and to them, that is Star Wars. However, I have 2 counterpoints to that. There's most certainly plenty of films that I and others of that generation grew up with that we enjoyed when we were kids who didn't really analyze what we enjoyed or didn't enjoy too much. But there's so many films like that that have been left by the wayside by us as we grew up and realized they weren't as great as we might have once thought. While others have stood the test of time, and I've come to appreciate them as much, if not more so, than I once did. But the prequels are sort of in the middle of that. While they are films that I've realized aren't as well made as some of us once thought as kids, we still find reasons to go back to them and discuss them in detailed level. Seriously, I don't see 12-hour videos being made to analyze Spy Spy Kids. I myself came to realize that the prequels were not the masterpieces I thought at still a very young age, but to this day I still find reasons to go back to them, hence this video. What is it about these movies that causes that? Is it just because it's Star Wars? Is it just because these movies are connected to an original trilogy of much better films, and that the mere fact of that and the exciting laser sword battles are enough for this series to leave more of an impression on us than anything else is, so that we carry it into adulthood? But there's another point to this debate that we must talk about when considering this. The Star Wars sequels. When Star Wars The Force Awakens came out, there was more hype around that film than, well, most any film that I've ever seen, but the movie itself was considered more of a remake and rehash of A New Hope than being its own thing. It would take a future movie to flesh out these characters and new storyline to show that this new batch of movies was worthwhile on its own, and, well, we know how that turned out. The Star Wars sequels starting with The Last Jedi began, and at the very least, caused a new division among Star Wars fans. The Star Wars sequels were plagued by a lack of a plan and dueling ideas, where each movie essentially tried to correct the last. The result in short terms was a trilogy that lacked any cohesion and little for anyone to latch onto in terms of story, character, or theme. I don't even need to tell you the shift I saw in how the world viewed Star Wars pre-Last Jedi versus post-Last Jedi, as a person who's had Star Wars with them since literally the year they were born. A marked drop in merchandise sales for Star Wars gradually occurred after The Last Jedi. Disney's endeavors to capitalize on the brand with attractions such as Star Wars Galaxy's Edge also bombed. Disney has been trying for years to get new Star Wars films off the ground, only to have countless films go in and out of development after production was booming before The Last Jedi was released. Meanwhile, a lot of us have been noting that, understandably so, Star Wars just hasn't been capturing the next generation like it used to. But compare that to the Star Wars prequels. The merchandise that would take up entire toy aisles, the amount sold for each film, the fact that they took a franchise created in the late 70s and created an entire new generation of dedicated Star Wars fans. The websites, the fan fiction. For a kid who grew up in the 2000s, Star Wars was a part of the air you breathed, and a massive part of the reason why it carried on through the culture was because of the Star Wars prequels. So, there's something about these films that caught on. They're flawed films, perhaps even objectively badly made films, yet so are the Star Wars sequels. Hard truth, it's true. But now we're nearly at the 10-year anniversary of Star Wars The Force Awakens, and I'm seeing less of a cultural legacy around that film or any of the Disney Star Wars stuff than I did for the prequels at this same point in its time. So, with that, is it because of the sequels? Is it because of the disappointment that many people felt around the Star Wars sequels that made them appreciate the prequels more? Because, once again, what most people can agree with when it comes to the Star Wars sequels is that as a trilogy, they do not have a cohesive story or a goal when you look at them all together. The prequels, for all their flaws, do have a goal in mind, a point. While the characterizations weren't perfect, I would still have a far better time describing what each character from the prequels is all about through their journey, unlike the characters from the sequels, which were underdeveloped and yanked around in their directions so much I couldn't tell you what they were supposed to be about or where they were ultimately supposed to end up. Meanwhile, problematic as it is in its execution, the prequels reached their goal of portraying the backstory of the original Star Wars trilogy and fitting that story together, while the sequels tried to continue or not continue the story by taking characters to places some considered to be unnatural. So, did the sequels show us just how bad it could get with continuations of Star Wars, making us all suddenly appreciate the prequels? Well, sort of. The truth is, there was always a strong fandom for the prequels even before the sequels. The appreciation only increased as the sequels came out, but in the reaction to the sequels lies the answer that I've been asking throughout this video. Why the prequels revived Star Wars fandom, its relevance in the culture, and still remain beloved by a wide range of people to this day, in spite of all their flaws and haters, while the sequels seem to have gone down the exact opposite path. What really is the difference? Well, actually, the explanation for why the Star Wars prequels were successful is the same explanation for why Star Wars the original trilogy was successful. And it also explains why the sequels were not nearly as successful and do not have the love that the prequels had at their 10-year mark. Well, the difference, to put it quite simply, is George Lucas. For his world of Star Wars, he had a specific vision. This world was based off of the old Flash Gordon serials it was inspired by, however many science fiction things that George Lucas had watched. But in addition to the world and the kind of vernacular that everyone would speak, he had a vision for an epic that would be about the fall of democracy and the rise of an empire, and about the heroes rising up to defeat that empire. And this sort of poetic epic storytelling is why people were attached to the original series and why people are attached to the prequels for all their flaws. But even the perceived flaws were some of the things that George Lucas was using to give Star Wars its flavor in the first place. Like, people say the dialogue in the prequel trilogy is really bad, but was the original trilogy much better?
The dialogue was a little bit difficult. I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out of the screenplay, and he finally did. And it's when, the line? Yes, boy, I'll never forget it as long as I live. I sometimes dream about this line. But we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Aquilai or Soas, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault. And I thought, who talks like this, George?
This is dialogue that is pulling from the original serials of Flash Gordon like George Lucas had intended. I think the difference in the prequels is you have actors who, well, not necessarily on a lower or higher caliber, just aren't making it work as well as the ones in the original series did. But to me, even the dialogue, the vernacular of this universe is what gives Star Wars its flavor, and something that made the subsequent films from Disney that tried to polish things up seem a bit different and not really authentically Star Wars. Because here's the thing, a film can be more cohesive and have more realistic dialogue, etc., but still lack anything to really make an impact on audiences or make people still want to return to the characters or universe. Star Wars Rogue One might be an example of that. It's grittier, more self-serious, and the dialogue strives to be less Flash Gordon, yet this film and its characters seem to have almost been forgotten by the mainstream at large, even with the more positive reception when it first came out. People can be very forgiving to a lot of media that's very flawed as long as there's something to connect to. Meanwhile, there are films with tighter scripts, more realistic dialogue, less flaws, that may completely fall by the wayside if they just lack any sort of spark to make it memorable or form a connection with the audience. That's really the component that answers why the Star Wars prequels have endured. It's the same exact reason why the original series was ultimately successful when it came out. They are both George's vision for a universe. They are both the same story. The vision of a world with its own politics and creatures and its own struggle for freedom, of its own hero's journey, with its own flavor of dialogue, with its own spirituality, and with that, a lot of deep themes about good versus evil. The original was about a protagonist who came from nothing, who discovered he had great power, and as he went on his journey, discovered the temptations with that great power, but ultimately did not falter in staying on the side of good. While the prequels are about someone who comes from nothing, who is thrust into a world of politics where he seems to be a tool even used by the good guys, as one side tells him to ignore his fears and reject emotion, and another side seduces him by playing into his fears, and we eventually see someone who is supposed to be a savior fall to the dark side. As much as people criticize the prequels and criticize the line from George Lucas,
again, it's like poetry, sort of they rhyme.
There is a poetry to these films, an epic Shakespearean element to them. Everything from the dialogue, the creatures, the world building, the struggles, and the characters and the types of people they were resonated with people and made them interested. The universal truths to it and the rise and fall storytelling resonated. The only difference is the original series had other creatives on it reining George and helping him refine his ideas. They are comparatively more tight and ironed out than the prequels, but that doesn't mean that it isn't the same tone or the same themes that drew everyone into this world in the first place. And that's what set these 6 films apart from the sequels. After the rehash that was The Force Awakens, the sequels desperately tried to remove themselves from George's vision. The Last Jedi did everything to subvert and uproot, even going as far as to uproot its own story. And that's why the great shift happened with the sequels. For many, The Last Jedi alone killed the illusion of the world, and no piece of content released afterwards has been able to bring it back. But even as some people ignore modern Star Wars content, as the series doesn't seem nearly as culturally relevant as it once was, and Disney seems confused at how to carry on, the original saga, yes, all original 6 films, including the prequels, still have a wide range of people who love them and still want to immerse themselves in this world. This is George's vision, and it resonates. Essentially, this solves the mystery of the prequels and why they connect with people, even though they're not objectively well-made films, why they still connect with people while other flawed films made by Disney have not. Would I have loved a world where, like the original trilogy, the prequels were more well-refined and their ideas were presented better? Of course. But I love George's vision of this world as much as a lot of other people do, and the prequels at the very least still have that. And I love re-exploring that, and I love the continuous discussion that the prequels have wrought. That is why, for all the flaws in these films, for all the craziness, for all the memes they've given us, for all the discussion, for all the good moments that they also gave us as well, for all the good themes and the truths in these films, that is why I say that the Star Wars prequels were actually a gift to humankind.